Welcome to Curiosity, the podcast where science meets wonder. Join us as we explore the fascinating, the innovative, and the unexpected, from the secrets of the cosmos to the marvels of everyday life. Each episode takes you on a journey to uncover the knowledge and stories that fuel our endless quest for understanding. Let your curiosity guide you.
Welcome. Today we're embarking on a really unique kind of intellectual journey. We're going to explore the most fascinating and, frankly, the most tragic archive imaginable, a library built entirely of absence.
It's a journey that really requires us to look past what's physically on the shelf. We're venturing into what you could call the Library of Unwritten Books. It's a profound phantom archive.
A phantom archive. I like
that.
that.
It holds the ghosts of our cultural output. So we're talking about works that were destroyed, abandoned, lost to fire, confiscated by tyrants, or just never finished because life or death or, personal demons got in the way.
Okay, so let's just unpack the emotional weight of this for a second. We've all felt that frustration, right? A TV show gets canceled on a cliffhanger, a favorite author retires. But what we're talking about here goes so much deeper.
It does.
These are potential masterpieces, works that could have fundamentally reshaped culture or history, even philosophy. Texts that now only exist as whispers and speculation, defining our world by the space they left empty.
And what's so fascinating and maybe a little uncomfortable about this whole subject is that it's not just about lost stories, it's about lost possibilities.
Alternate timelines.
Exactly. Alternate timelines for human knowledge, for our cultural evolution. These unwritten books, they haunt the margins of literary history. And in a lot of cases, they're actually more influential than the books that did survive.
And that's the paradox we really have to grapple with, isn't it? These books have achieved this strange, untouchable kind of immortality because they don't exist in a finished form.
They're forever perfect in potential.
Right. They can never disappoint us. We can only imagine the full scope of their genius. They're the ultimate literary ghosts, defined by this imaginative vacuum they created.
And that is really the heart of what we're looking at today. We want to move past just the romantic myth of the lost novel and really examine specific, detailed, and often just heartbreaking anecdotes.
To use these stories to show how immense, but also how astonishingly fragile our whole cultural output really is.
Yes, exactly.
So before we jump into the stories of, fire and silence, we need to define the architecture of this non-existent library. When we're talking about absence, what's the scope here? These aren't just like doodles in a notebook or half-baked ideas.
No. The sources we've looked at describe texts that were nearly finished or were deeply crucial to an author's entire career, or were potentially civilization-defining in their scope.
So how do we navigate this? There has to be a framework.
There is. To get a handle on the sheer volume of cultural annihilation, we really have to establish some categories of loss. These categories help us understand the why. Was it an internal flaw? Was it a pure accident? Or was it a malicious external force?
Okay, give us the framework.
We can break it down into 4 primary categories. First, we have destruction by the author or by accident. This is the most personal one and often the most tragic.
Self-sabotage.
Right. Self-censorship that's born from doubt or despair or even religious mania. Or it could just be a simple, cruel calamity, a fire, a flood. It's the internal threat.
The ultimate conflict, where the creator turns on their own creation.
Exactly. Then, second, we examine interruption by death. This is the category that leaves us with all the fragments and the mysteries, the agony of incompleteness. The author literally dies mid-sentence, sometimes without leaving any kind of map for where they were headed.
The classic cliffhanger, but magnified to a scale of literary tragedy that can never, ever be resolved.
Third, and this is probably the most chilling category, is destruction by censorship or tyranny.
The societal loss.
Yes, the deliberate, often very public act of erasure by outside forces, governments, mobs, zealots. This isn't just losing one book, it's the intentional destruction of entire bodies of knowledge.
A civilization-level catastrophe. We'll definitely have to spend some time on the ripple effects of that kind of malice.
And finally, our 4th category is loss due to silence or impossibility. These are the books that were never truly begun. They were lost to an author's perfectionism, a personal crisis, or just the slow failure of the human mind. The result is often decades of this profound, agonizing public silence.
That structure gives us the foundation we need. So let's begin with the flames, with the works consumed by the authors themselves or their gatekeepers, or just the cruel randomness of an accident. This really forces us to confront that often The biggest threat to a masterpiece comes from inside the creative process itself.
It does. It shows that the decision to destroy a work is often way more complex and psychologically loaded than the decision to create it in the first place.
Let's start with a foundational, just deeply painful tragedy of self-annihilation. Nikolai Gogol and the Fate of Dead Souls, Part 2. The first part, from 1842, was this huge satirical triumph, right? Exposing all the corruption in Russia.
A massive success. And he promised this grand trilogy, but he never delivered the second part.
And the vision for the trilogy was monumental.
Oh, absolutely. Gogol saw it as a kind of Russian version of Dante's Divine Comedy.
Yeah.
Part 1, the book we have, was the Inferno, the hell of Russian corruption. Part 2 was meant to be the Purgatory.
The moral struggle.
Yes. The characters attempting redemption, self-improvement. And then Part 3 was supposed to be the Paradise, this vision of a morally whole, redeemed Russia.
Which makes what he did in February 1852 just devastating. He wasn't just throwing away a novel. He was throwing away a national spiritual project.
He was. And he'd worked on Part 2 for a decade. But he was suffering from this severe depression. And, crucially, he'd fallen under the intense influence of a fanatical Russian Orthodox priest, a Father Matvey Konstantinovsky.
Okay, and this priest had a specific problem with his work.
He convinced Gogol that his writing, because it was satire and fiction, was sinful, that it was actively damaging to his soul.
So the destruction wasn't just artistic self-doubt. It was a kind of religious mania mixed with this profound self-loathing.
Absolutely. So in a fit of despair and self-censure, he threw the nearly complete manuscript, we're talking hundreds of pages, into his fireplace and just watched it burn. And what makes it so gut-wrenching is that he had finished it or was on the very, very brink of finishing it.
Did anyone get a glimpse of this purgatory before it was consumed?
Fortunately, yes, a few. Friends who had heard Gogol read chapters aloud described them as even better than the first volume, darker, more psychologically deep, and showing this really mature engagement with the idea of moral reform. This was potentially the true fulfillment of his entire vision.
And the immediate aftermath just compounds the tragedy.
It does. Gogol died just 9 days after burning the manuscript, having essentially starved himself in a state of penance and delirium. The only bits that survived were a few fragments, early chapters he'd shared with friends who, thankfully, had made copies.
Just fragments.
Scholars call them shards of a shattered mirror. You're forced to try and imagine this whole devastatingly beautiful image from just a few broken pieces. The complete reflection of Russia's moral struggle is just, it's gone, lost to that fireplace.
That feeling of deliberate personal erasure driven by internal conflict, it's tragically echoed in the mystery around Sylvia Plath's final novel. I think she called it Double Exposure.
Double exposure or double bind, yes. In this case, it's not fire, it's more like ice. It's cold, and it's charged with controversy and suspicion.
And her novel was reportedly finished, or very nearly finished, at the time of her suicide in '63.
It was. And then the manuscript just vanished completely.
And the central figure in this vanishing act is her estranged husband, the poet Ted Hughes.
Hughes is absolutely central because he was her literary executor. He was the gatekeeper. Now, he claimed the manuscript was either lost or accidentally destroyed, but, and this is the critical complication, he had already admitted to destroying Plath's final journal.
Why? What was his justification for that?
He argued that he didn't want their children to have to read it. Now, you have to remember the extreme acrimony and betrayal that defined the end of their relationship. The novel would have, without a doubt, offered a devastating, unflattering account of those last months.
So the belief is that he destroyed it to protect his own reputation.
That is the prevailing scholarly belief, yes. It's very hard to see it any other way.
So this moves the act from self-annihilation, like with Gogol, to destruction by someone protecting their own legacy. What did we lose artistically?
This is the real tragedy. This novel was written during what everyone agrees was Plath's white-hot creative period, the same intensely productive time that gave us the poetry collection Ariel.
Right.
The Bell Jar was based on her breakdown years earlier. Double Exposure would have been her mature artistic vision, her prose dealing with motherhood, the breakdown of her marriage, betrayal, creative fury. It would have captured the psychological intensity of her final months.
So we lost her artistic peak in prose form.
We did. It permanently prevents us from seeing how she evolved as a novelist after the Bell Jar.
So if Gogol's act was one of religious frenzies, and Plath's was likely an act of personal reputation control, the burning of Lord Byron's memoirs in 1824 was an act of, communal prudery, society protecting its own decorum.
That's a perfect way to put it. The Byron incident is a stunning, just shocking example of cultural custodians prioritizing social acceptability over historical truth. Byron, the ultimate romantic icon, left behind a complete, devastatingly frank memoir. He held nothing back.
And the content was the reason it was so scandalous, even for him.
Exactly. Contemporary reports confirmed it was filled with excruciatingly honest accounts of his affairs, his bisexual relationships, and, crucially, his incestuous relationship with his half-sister, Augusta Lee. On top of that, it had his cynical, blistering views on the establishment. It was dynamite.
And he'd entrusted it to his friend, the poet Thomas More. But after Byron died, More got cold feet.
He just couldn't withstand the pressure. A group gathered at the office of Byron's publisher, John Murray. You had family members, friends, creditors. They read parts of the memoir and were just utterly horrified by the scandal it would unleash.
So they took a vote.
They held an informal vote, and despite Moore's desperate attempts to save it, they decided it was too great a threat to the family name and to public morals.
And they didn't just lock it away, they performed a ritual.
Witnesses described it as a deliberate performance of erasure. They tore the hundreds of pages of handwritten truth and fed them, piece by piece, into the fireplace right there in the London office. It was an intentional sacrifice of truth on the altar of manufactured morality.
One witness called it a murder of truth. That seems pretty apt.
It is. We lost this unvarnished insight into one of literature's most complex figures, all because a small committee feared a scandal. It raises this crucial question. What makes a work valuable? It's artistry, or the historical truth it tells. In this case, they decided a comfortable lie was better than a difficult truth.
That premeditated malice is chilling. But sometimes, as you said, the loss is just. Pure, cruel bad luck.
Which brings us to Malcolm Lowry and his novel, In Ballast to the White Sea.
Right, Lowry, who was really struggling with alcoholism and with his masterpiece Under the Volcano, was living in this little squatter's shack on a beach in British Columbia in 1944. He was working on both books at the same time.
And then just mundane disaster strikes.
The shack caught fire. Lowry and his wife barely escaped with their lives, but both manuscripts, the nearly complete Under the Volcano and this second novel, In Ballast to the White Sea, were completely consumed.
But the miracle is that Under the Volcano survived. It became one of the great novels of the 20th century. Yes, and that was an act of incredible mental fortitude. Lowry managed to reconstruct it from memory and from earlier drafts he'd thankfully shared. But In Ballast to the White Sea was just gone, absolutely gone. He tried to rewrite it for the rest of his life, but fell into this deep, agonizing depression, convinced he had lost his greatest, most groundbreaking work.
What suggests it was so exceptional? Even more so than Under the Volcano.
The few pieces that survived, or the descriptions from people who'd read the drafts, suggest it was even more innovative. The prose was more structurally daring than Under the Volcano, which was already highly experimental. It was pushing the boundaries of language and narrative even further.
So it was a potential evolutionary path for his genius that was just cut short.
Utterly cut short by simple bad luck. We have the masterpiece, but we lost its even more daring twin to a beach shack fire.
If the Lowry story is accidental annihilation, the story of Thomas Carlyle's The French Revolution is this strange mix of disaster and redemption.
This is a textbook case of sublime catastrophe followed by, well, truly sublime human fortitude. In 1835, Carlyle loaned the only manuscript of his history. This represented 2 years of grueling, painstaking work to his friend, the philosopher John Stuart Mill.
And here comes that incredible, mundane cruelty that defines so much of this library.
Mill's housemaid, who was apparently very efficient but couldn't read, saw this massive pile of hundreds of pages of handwritten historical analysis and just assumed it was waste paper.
Oh, no.
Over several days, she used the manuscript page by page as kindling to start the fires.
Using the history of the French Revolution for kindling, the irony is just excruciating.
Mill was absolutely devastated when he figured it out. He rushed to Carlyle's house, reportedly white-faced, and just announced, "It is gone, all gone." Carlyle was frozen in shock. He described it as if the world had just ended.
But the miracle is he rewrote the entire thing.
He did. After a period of despair, he demonstrated this astonishing mental endurance and rewrote the entire volume from memory and research. The published version is now a foundational historical classic. It's maybe the most spectacular example of human resilience in the face of literary disaster.
But the philosophical question remains, doesn't it? Was the rewritten text better, or was it just different?
And that's the crucial point. That's what moves this from a fun anecdote to a real analytical puzzle. We celebrate that the text survived, but we'll never know what nuances, what initial fire of creation, what rhythm was in that first version, the one that was driven by the uninterrupted flow.
Versus the traumatic, painstaking act of recreation.
Exactly. Was the second version more polished, more considered, or was it inevitably less alive than the first? The loss here isn't the text itself, it's the originality of the text.
That helps us transition to maybe the most purely philosophical act of non-completion. Franz Kafka's unburnable legacy.
Kafka, known for his relentless perfectionism and profound self-doubt, left a very clear, explicit final mandate. He told his closest friend, Max Brod, to burn all of his unpublished manuscripts after he died.
And this included novels he had finished, but just deemed unworthy.
Yes. A clear, final, deeply considered wish from the artist. But Brod, he ignored it completely.
And thank goodness for the history of world literature.
Right. Brod defied Kafka's wishes and published The Trial, The Castle, and America. These unfinished, fragmented works became the foundational texts of 20th century existentialism and modernism. Without Brod's betrayal, Kafka would be a footnote.
But this raises a profound, unavoidable question about artistic ownership. If we respect an artist's autonomy, how do we justify Brod's decision, even if we benefit from it? Don't we have to respect the author's final wishes?
It forces us into a real ethical corner. Brod's argument was that the works were too important to humanity to be destroyed. And he also suggested that Kafka, by leaving the task to him, maybe secretly wanted them to survive.
That's a bit of a stretch, maybe?
It is. But we, the readers, celebrate this betrayal because the Kafka we revere, the dark prophet of bureaucracy and anxiety, is a creation of what survived against his express wishes. The work was rescued from the author's own self-censure.
It sets a dangerous precedent, though, doesn't it? If we decide we know better than the author, where does that stop?
It asks us to balance the ethical right of an individual artist against the collective cultural right to genius. In Kafka's unique case, the works transcended him. They became vital commentary on the human condition. So we choose to prioritize the cultural benefit over the individual's command. It's a profound, uneasy paradox.
This first section makes it so clear that creation is only the beginning. Survival is a whole other battle. But let's shift now to the trauma of incompleteness. The work's not destroyed, but just left mid-sentence by death. These are the fragments that drive people mad with curiosity.
These are the classic cliffhangers, but magnified to a tragic scale. They remind us that death respects neither plot structure nor publishing deadlines.
And we have to start with the king of all literary mysteries, Charles Dickens, The Mystery of Edwin Drood.
Dickens, in 1870, was the most popular novelist of his time. He was known for providing these complete, satisfying resolutions. And then he dies, suddenly from a stroke, with his final novel left unfinished at precisely the halfway point.
And it was a fascinating departure for him, too. It was darker, more focused on a single crime.
Much darker. The plot centers on the disappearance of Edwin Drood, his opium-addicted uncle John Jasper, a choirmaster with this sinister double life, and Drood's fiancée, Rosa, whom Jasper obsessively desires. The setup is a perfect storm of mystery, addiction, and obsession.
The central question is, did the obsessive uncle murder his nephew? Or did Drood fake his own death to escape and maybe come back for revenge?
And Dickens left absolutely no notes, nothing, no outline detailing the resolution. And this absence launched a fan and academic obsession that has lasted for over 150 years.
People have written their own endings, right?
Dozens of continuations. There are entire societies dedicated to solving the puzzle. In the early days, people even held seances, trying to channel Dickens' ghost for the answer.
So the unfinished state itself became more famous than the half-written book.
Exactly. The intended solution is the central, agonizing mystery of English literature. The work is forever fixed in this state of tantalizing perfect potential. We read the beginning knowing there will never be the closure Dickens intended, which makes it maybe the most famous case of narrative rupture in history.
F. Scott Fitzgerald faced a similar tragedy with The Last Tycoon. He died so young, in 1940, desperately trying to write a novel that would restore his reputation.
He was only 44, suffering from terrible health and financial problems, alcoholism. Yet he was pouring all his remaining energy into what he called his most mature novel. He wanted to recapture the brilliance of The Great Gatsby.
What state was the manuscript in when he died?
He'd completed about 70,000 words, so roughly half of it. And crucially, he left extensive notes, chapter summaries, character outlines for the rest of the plot. His friend, the critic Edmund Wilson, gathered it all and published the fragment.
And the critical response to that fragment was very positive.
Universally so. Critics called it extraordinary, disciplined, psychologically astute. They argued it was some of the finest writing he'd done since Gatsby. It's set in Hollywood, focused on the producer Monroe star who was based on Irving Thalberg, and it captures the glamour, the corruption, the whole fading promise of the American dream in the film industry.
But just like with Drood, the story ends right before the crisis hits.
It cuts off abruptly, just as the tension is at its peak. Fitzgerald's notes show Starr was heading for this tragic confrontation, industrial intrigue, betrayal, romantic loss, probably ending in his death. We're left frozen mid-scene just as the tragedy begins to unfold.
Moving from those classic cliffhangers to more modern fragments, the story of David Foster Wallace's The Pale King is defined not by a lack of material, but by the sheer, overwhelming volume of its incompleteness.
When Wallace died in 2008, he left behind a true archaeological ruin. I mean, literally thousands of pages of manuscript, notes, competing outlines, multiple contradictory versions of chapters. It was a massive, brilliant, but heartbreakingly disorganized mess.
So his editor and widow had to assemble it. It was less editing and more literary construction.
It was an impossible task. The book that was published in 2011 is clearly a work of genius, but it's structurally ambiguous. Some sections are perfectly polished, others are rough drafts. Plot lines appear and vanish. The editor had to make these huge decisions about how to structure it.
The novel is famously about the boredom of the IRS, but it's really about consciousness, isn't it?
Fundamentally, yes. It's about boredom, attention, self-awareness, and the heroism of just surviving the mind-numbing repetition of modern life. The pieces we have are magnificent, but they're ruins of a temple. You can see the quality of the marble, but you can't know the final form. And the tragedy is that his own despair and perfectionism contributed to its incompleteness.
We see that same internal conflict, the author demanding erasure, with Vladimir Nabokov and his final novel, The Original of Laura.
Just like Kafka, Nabokov explicitly requested that his final fragmentary novel be destroyed after his death in 1977. But his wife, Vera, unlike Broad, couldn't bring herself to do it.
So she passed the burden on to their son, Dmitri.
And Dmitri spent 3 decades agonizing over the decision. The novel existed on 138 handwritten index cards. The entire literary world just watched this decades-long ethical dilemma play out. Honor your father's final wish or preserve what might be a final piece of art.
And he ultimately chose publication in 2009.
He did. When it was published, the response was very mixed because it really is like a literary autopsy. Sentences trail off, the cards are printed out of order, and in this very meta way, the protagonist is trying to metaphorically erase his own body through willpower, which perfectly mirrors Nabokov's desire for the text's erasure.
So publishing it didn't solve the problem of incompleteness, it just made it public.
Exactly. It forces the reader to confront the ethical dimension of this whole library every time they try to piece the index cards together.
And finally, in this section on incompleteness, we have the special category of the impossible work, best exemplified by J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion.
Tolkien spent more than 60 years creating the vast mythological history and linguistic framework for Middle-earth, the material we know as the Silmarillion. He was constantly revising, changing names, adding contradictory versions. He died in 1973 without ever delivering a finished text.
His son, Christopher Tolkien, compiled the version that was published in 1977.
Which was a remarkable feat of editing. But Christopher later published volumes of The History of Middle-earth, which revealed that his 1977 compilation was really his own interpretation, his own synthesis of often contradictory material.
So what does that mean for the original intention?
It means the true Silmarillion, the single definitive version that would have met Tolkien's notoriously perfectionist standards, was likely an impossible object. The scope was too vast, the details too complex, and his tendency to perpetually revise was just too strong. The loss here isn't a manuscript burned, but the loss of a definitive conclusion, an absence born not of too little creation, but of an overwhelming ceaseless flow of it.
We've examined internal failures and accidents. Now we have to confront the civilization-level catastrophes, the erasure of entire bodies of work by tyranny. This is where the fragility of culture becomes exponential.
This section forces us to realize that human knowledge is incredibly contingent. A single act of malice or political stupidity can wipe out thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, permanently altering human progress.
And the most famous ghost library, the symbol of all cultural loss, is the Library of Alexandria.
The popular myth that it burned down in one single fire is compelling, but the reality is more complex. It actually declined over centuries through political upheaval, neglect, and a series of disasters. Caesar's forces caused fire damage in 48 BCE. The Serapeum Annex was destroyed in 391 CE. It was a slow death.
But regardless of the timeline, the scale of the loss is just staggering. Yeah.
At its height, it held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. It wasn't just a passive library. Agents were sent out to copy texts, and incoming ships had their books confiscated by law so they could be copied. It was the absolute knowledge center of the ancient world.
So we look through the catalog of the unwritten. What specifically did we lose? Can we quantify it?
To some extent, and the extent is horrifying. We lost an estimated 90% of Greek drama. That's hundreds of plays by Sophocles and Euripides. We only have 7 of Sophocles' 120 plays.
7 out of 120.
We lost crucial scientific works, including the calculations of Aristarchus, who proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 1,800 years before Copernicus. We lost complete histories, mathematical treatises, early gospels.
So this isn't just an aesthetic loss. It's a loss of technological and philosophical momentum. If Aristarchus's ideas had survived and been accepted, did humanity lose 18 centuries of progress because of a few politically motivated fires?
That is precisely the lasting, devastating impact. The destruction of Alexandria is the ultimate metaphor for cultural annihilation. Real books burned, real knowledge vanished, and we are still paying the price for that loss today, constantly having to rediscover basic truths.
Jumping forward 2 millennia, the Nazi book burnings of the 1930s show that this malice, this desire to control knowledge, is never far from the surface.
May 10th, 1933, in Berlin and other cities, it remains one of the most horrifying spectacles of modern censorship. Nazis threw tens of thousands of books by authors they deemed un-German, Jewish, communist, liberal into these huge public bonfires. The destruction was celebratory.
They targeted the intellectual heart of the West: Freud, Einstein, Hemingway.
And that was just the public spectacle. Millions of books were destroyed throughout the regime. But critically, they didn't just burn existing books. The regime prevented new ones from being written by systematically exiling, killing, or censoring thousands of authors. They starved the culture of new ideas.
That prevention, the intentional silence forced on thousands of brilliant minds, that's the largest unwritten library of all.
It is the ultimate erasure of potential. Think of the philosopher Walter Benjamin. He was fleeing the Nazis in 1940. Fearing capture, he died by suicide at the Spanish border. He was carrying a black leather briefcase with a final, important manuscript, maybe his last great work on history, and it just vanished upon his death. We don't even know the title. A major philosophical work gone instantly into the shadow archive.
A similar, vast, and even more systemic erasure happened during China's Cultural Revolution.
From 1966 to 1976, Red Guards, empowered by Mao's regime, destroyed countless books, manuscripts, and artifacts they deemed feudal or bourgeois. Millions of volumes went into bonfires, but the nature of this loss was unique.
How so? Different from just burning printed books.
Crucially, much of what they destroyed weren't mass-produced books. They were unique handwritten manuscripts, rare family histories, personal notebooks, unique editions of classical texts. Unlike printed books that might survive elsewhere, these were destroyed absolutely. And the violence drove scholars and writers to suicide or silence, creating this vast negative space in Chinese cultural history, a vacuum where a whole generation of culture should have been.
The ultimate form of tyranny, though, might be the total state erasure in Stalinist Russia, where writers were literally unpersoned.
Under Stalin, when writers fell out of favor, it was comprehensive. Their books were purged from libraries, their names were removed from encyclopedias, and often they were executed. They were erased as if they'd never existed, an attempt to delete memory itself.
Like Isaac Babel, the master of the short story.
Babel was arrested in 1939, shot in 1940, and the secret police, the NKVD, didn't just kill him. They confiscated all of his manuscripts. A novel in progress, plays, stories, decades of private notes, all of it disappeared into the state archives and has never been recovered. It's the absolute erasure of decades of creative output by the state.
But the survival of Osip Mandelstam's poetry is one of the most incredible stories of human defiance against this.
Mandelstam was arrested for a poem critical of Stalin and died in the Gulag. His works were immediately purged. But his survival, and the survival of his most important poems, is due entirely to his widow, Nadezhda. She literally committed his poems to memory. She carried them in her mind, a living archive, through decades of Soviet oppression.
A human safeguard, protecting his words until it was safe to write them down again.
Yes. The Soviet laws emphasizes that if you destroy the people, you destroy memory. Nadezhda's act reminds us that the Library of Unwritten Books often contains works that survive only through the immense, dangerous dedication of others. It's a testament to human memory against state power.
We've covered malice, fire, and death. Now we need to look at works lost to silence, to perfectionism, or the slow failure of the human mind. This moves us into the psychological landscape of the unwritten book.
This is often the most agonizing category, where the struggle isn't an external force, but the paralyzing demands the artist places on themselves.
And the definitive modern example has to be Harper Lee's silence after To Kill a Mockingbird in 1960. One of the most beloved, successful American novels ever, and then nothing for 55 years.
The paradox is profound. She wins the Pulitzer, achieves instant, enduring fame, and then just retreats. She was crushed by the pressure to follow up a universally accepted masterpiece. And when Go Set a Washman was published in 2015, we find out it's not a new novel at all, but the original draft of Mockingbird.
So the agonizing question is, did she destroy manuscripts? Or did she just succumb to writer's block under that immense pressure?
We truly don't know. Her silence itself became a kind of unwritten or a decades-long statement about the crushing weight of perfectionism and the burden of iconic success. If she wrote other novels, they died with her, victims of internal forces.
Cormac McCarthy's story gives us a different view of perfectionism, resulting in decades of delayed masterpieces rather than silence.
McCarthy spent nearly 50 years working on his companion novels, The Passenger and Stella Maris. He started them in the 1970s, wrote monumental works like Blood Meridian and The Road in Between, but kept returning to these two books, perpetually revising.
The rumor for decades was that he was holding them to impossible standards.
That's what it seems. They finally came out in 2022 when he was 89.
Yeah.
And they are brilliant, philosophically dense works about siblinghood, physics, madness.
But the final versions we read are fundamentally marked by time and mortality.
Precisely. They are the work of an elderly man wrestling with death and the limits of consciousness. The versions he was working on in the 80s or 90s, the ones that might have carried a different weight, are, in a very real sense, unwritten books, lost to his decades-long process of obsessive revision.
The ultimate heartbreak in this category, though, has to be Gabriel García Márquez's final struggle against his own biology.
Márquez, the master of memory, was diagnosed with dementia in his final years, and his sons shared the heartbreaking fact that he had to abandon his final novel, which was reportedly about love in old age.
The subject matter just makes the loss even more profound. The master of memory, trying to write about old age love while his own memory was dissolving.
It's the tragedy of consciousness itself. His sons described watching this great genius struggle, forgetting what he'd written days before, losing the thread of his own narrative. That unrecoverable novel represents the ultimate unwritten ending genius, unable to resist the biological decline of the mind.
We've looked backward at physical destruction, but now we have to look forward. The digital age is introducing new, unique forms of loss and new kinds of unwritten books we might not even recognize yet.
We often assume technology guarantees preservation, the cloud, backups, but it creates entirely new vulnerabilities. Future scholars may face a profound digital dark age.
If everything's on the cloud, what's the risk?
The risk is accessibility. Vast amounts of 21st century writing might become inaccessible, not because the data is gone, but because of format decay or bit rot, obsolete file formats, proprietary software that no longer runs, dead hard drives. The information exists, but the key to unlocking it is lost. It becomes encrypted by time.
And then there's the phenomenon of vast, publicly begun works, the incomplete web serials, massive fan fiction projects.
These are new artifacts for the Library of Unwritten Books. They start with huge public engagement, hundreds of thousands of words, but then the author loses interest or life gets in the way, leaving readers with this tantalizing space between published and unpublished, finished and unfinished.
And what about social media? That's where some of the most innovative contemporary writing exists.
Absolutely. Some of our era's sharpest textual output exists in vulnerable posts and threads, but they're highly fragile. Platforms shut down, accounts get deleted, and the work just vanishes, often without proper archiving. It's a new, vulnerable archive being created and destroyed every day.
This whole exploration leads us to our final analysis. Why do these unfinished and destroyed works haunt us so much? Why this deep human fascination with absence?
I think it works on several profound levels. First, they represent the fundamental human anxiety about incompleteness. They're a memento mori, a reminder that death can interrupt our lives, our stories, mid-sentence. Dickens, Fitzgerald. Their incompleteness mirrors the sudden, brutal incompleteness of mortality.
And there's the pure potential, the imaginative space they live in.
Exactly. The unfinished work exists in the realm of pure, untainted potential. It can be anything you want it to be. Edwin Drood is Schrodinger's masterpiece, simultaneously brilliant and disappointing until it's finished. And since it never will be, it remains forever in that perfect, tantalizing superposition, unable to fail.
And what about the erased works? The books burned by tyranny.
Those force us to confront the fragility of culture itself. They show us how easily millennia of wisdom can vanish in a moment of stupidity or malice. They're a constant, sobering reminder that human culture is contingent. It's not guaranteed.
So what does this all mean for us? The Library of Unwritten Books isn't a place we can visit, but it's an essential concept we have to recognize.
It is the shadow library, the antimatter twin of everything that exists on the shelves we can see. Every physical library you enter holds the ghost presence of what was lost, what was abandoned, what was never written. We can't recover what was destroyed, but we have to acknowledge the weight of that absence.
So the ultimate takeaway for you, the person listening, is one of profound gratitude and responsibility.
Every single book we possess is a minor miracle of survival. It navigated authorial self-doubt, house fires, tyranny, and the slow decay of technology to get to you. We have to actively value what's here, support living writers while they can still produce, and consciously protect our cultural heritage against both fire and indifference. If we ignore the historical fragility of culture, we guarantee the growth of the shadow library.
We have to end with that final powerful thought. If all the works we talked about today, Gogol's complete trilogy, Plath's final novel, the lost plays of Sophocles, the scientific treatises of Alexandria, if they all existed, complete and published, in a parallel universe.
Then the question is this. Considering the scientific, philosophical, and moral knowledge that was lost, specifically Aristarchus's heliocentrism and Babel's final manuscripts, what major cultural or scientific path did humanity take in that world? And what profound, life-altering lesson about shame, redemption, history, or consciousness did we miss in this world? The one that is perpetually defined by its own immense, unrecoverable absence.